Anthony Sarducki was not a smart guy. The problem was that he was smart enough to realize that he wasn't very smart. He didn't have the benefit of blissful ignorance. What made it even worse was that the guys who worked with him on security at the house knew it too and nicknamed him Gump. Being just another Tony in an Italian family meant that he always had some kind of nickname. Because if you shout, "Hey, Tony," at a family meeting, so many heads will rise up that it will look like a colony of meerkats. But being called Gump was especially offensive. Over time, he realized that being annoyed about it would only encourage them more, and he simply tolerated it with a tight smile. But he swore more than once that if he ever came within arm's length of Zemeckis, he would definitely beat everything out of him. But despite his not very high mental ability, Anthony had good common sense, and common sense is good because it helps you notice troubles. And just now trouble was about to come down the stairs towards him. Anthony stood at the front door of his boss's house. This was his place. He was the person who greeted everyone in the big mansion. Tall and handsome, he often made people feel secure with his smile and good-natured demeanor, making him ideal for greeting guests. Under his left arm was a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber pistol, and it was not for show. Anthony could shoot straight, which also made him ideal for meeting those who were not guests. Anthony was carefully examining the front of the house through the bulletproof glass door when he heard the distinctive sound of high heels hitting the tiled floor. He turned and looked up the marble stairs and saw the boss's wife smiling down at him. "Good morning, Anthony," she purred with a wide smile. A part of Anthony melted every time he saw Andrea Cavini. If you look up the word trophy wife in the dictionary, you'll find a picture of her, he always thought. Placing her hand on the railing, she walked down the stairs majestically, like a queen owning everything she saw. She was amazing. The dark brown hair that fell over her shoulders looked like she had just stepped out of a salon. Her legs were almost a national treasure, and her thighs and breasts could make the Pope cry with joy. Her face was impeccably made up, and she looked absolutely stunning in a tight green dress that stopped mid-thigh. Anthony had heard his boss once complain about how much she spent every month to look this good at 42, and it was a staggering amount. The cost of makeup, spa treatments, clothes, shoes, jewelry, workout equipment, hair and nail care, and many other small items was more than half of what Anthony earned in a year. "Hello, Mrs. Coveney. How are you today?" he muttered. She stepped down from the last step, walked up to him, and put her hand on his chest. "Anthony, how many times have I asked you to call me Andrea?" she said with a sly smile. Anthony blushed slightly. "A million times, ma'am, but you know how Mr. Coveney feels about familiarity." The words were jumbled in his mouth. "Smart man," said a deep male voice behind them. They both turned around to see Dante Cavini smiling from the next room. Andrea smiled widely at her husband. He seemed the complete opposite of the classic middle-aged Italian. Tall and slender, broad-shouldered and narrow-waisted. A wonderful example of a mature man. His black, curly hair streaked with gray was neatly trimmed. A well-groomed mustache and goatee framed his smile. Andrea walked over and kissed her husband, who put his arm around her waist. He looked at her figure in that gorgeous dress and matching shoes. Her purse hung from her elbow. "Where are you going, dressed for one of Carmine's parties?" Dante asked seriously. Andrea smiled sweetly. "Just for coffee." Dante looked at her in surprise. "Coffee again? I have a full-time cook in my kitchen with a $10,000 coffee machine imported from fucking France, and you still go get coffee?" His beautiful wife shrugged and smiled coquettishly. "I use the machine sometimes, but I like to order from the menu. Every time I take something different. I never know what I'll choose until I arrive." Dante waved his hands. "Okay, go." She walked over and kissed his chin. "You could come with me if you want." Her voice was low and seductive. Dante smiled. "Sorry, honey, but I have a meeting with the guys from Staten Island. Maybe next time." Andrea shrugged and headed for the door. "You keep saying that, and I'll end up in the arms of another man." This was her frequent reaction when Dante refused to accompany her in requests. She cast a seductive glance at Anthony, who looked slightly unnerved by the attention. Dante watched her get into her Jaguar and drive away. Then he looked at Anthony. She often goes out for coffee, right? Anthony thought for a moment before answering. Yes, Mr. Coveney, 4 or 5 times a week. Dante thought for a few moments, looking at the fading headlights of Andrea's car. Anthony, would you like to change your post at the door for a moment? The big man smiled. Oh yeah, that would be great. I'm bored when I'm here. Dante stopped him with a raised finger. He knew Andrea's favorite coffee shop was Apollo, judging by the dozens of cups the housekeeper threw out. The nearest Apollo is on 10th Avenue. Take the green SUV that the chef uses for shopping and go there. Find my wife, but don't let her know you're there. Check who she's dating. Call me when you get there. Okay, Mr. Coveney? Your order, madam, the barista said, handing Andrea a tall latte. She smiled and handed the girl her credit card, but she raised her hand. Your coffee has already been paid for, the barista said. Her perfect eyebrows rose in surprise. Is it true? Who paid for it? The girl looked around and pointed to the table. This man, he was at another cash register. Andrea stepped away from the counter to make room for the next customer and looked at the man the barista pointed at. This wasn't the first time someone had bought her coffee, but usually those who did would immediately try to make eye contact with her. This man was sitting absorbed in reading on his tablet and drinking coffee. He looked tall, with thick dark hair and heavy-framed dark glasses. Andrea walked towards his table and, as she got closer, realized that he was quite attractive. Holy heavens, it's Clark Kent, she thought with a smile. Walking over to the table, she cleared her throat. The man looked up and smiled at her. How can I help? Andrea was a little embarrassed and said, I just wanted to thank you for paying for my coffee. It was very nice. The man looked surprised. Oh, you're welcome. The customer in front of me paid for my coffee, so I just passed the baton on. Now Andrea was surprised. It turns out I broke the chain of generosity, she said, covering her mouth and laughing slightly. I'm terribly ashamed. The man looked around the cafe. Would you like to sit down? There are almost no free tables left. Andrea looked back and realized that he was right. Yes, thank you. She pushed back her chair, sat down and crossed her right leg over her left, smoothing her skirt over her tanned legs. You can restart the chain next time, the man said with a smile, and then looked at her with interest. I've seen you here before, he said, and extended his hand. My name is Randall. She gave him her hand in return. Andrea. Outside, Anthony looked out the window that was next to the wall. He could see Mrs. Coveney clearly, and within a moment he was talking to Mr. Coveney on the phone. Is she with anyone? A deep voice came from the receiver. Yes, boss. She is sitting with some man, but they don't seem to know each other. They just shook hands as if they were meeting for the first time. The cafe is crowded. Dante thought about it. Anthony, is Mrs. Coveney smiling? He knew his wife well. If she was flirting, she smiled. Anthony immediately replied, No, boss, the man doesn't even look at her. He was looking at his tablet. Satisfied with the answer, Dante sighed. Okay, Anthony, come home. I'll talk to Polly about moving you around more. I can't let my guards go crazy with boredom. Anthony smiled. Thank you, Mr. Coveney. Andrea sighed as her new acquaintance returned to his tablet. She felt a little uncomfortable sitting next to him, and glancing at him out of the corner of her eye, she saw a mixture of boyish attractiveness and hard-worker physics. More Christopher Reeve than Henry Cavill, she thought. But what irritated her most was that he completely ignored her. She wasn't used to this, and she didn't like it. You said you saw me before. Do you come here often? She asked, blowing on her cup. Randall looked up at her. Yes, I work at the university and live nearby. This place allows you to be among people and at the same time remain unnoticed. Just disappear into the city crowd. Andrea nodded and beamed with a dazzling smile. Oh, I understand you so well. Randall couldn't help but laugh. Her brows furrowed, and she took a deep breath. Did I say something funny? Randall smiled and shrugged. Well, it's not that funny, but yes, a little. Please explain, Andrea said, crossing her arms over her chest. The man shrugged. Well, you just can't blend in with the crowd. Her mouth opened, but she didn't have time to say anything. For starters, you are stunningly attractive, dressed in designer clothes and adorned with tens of thousands of dollars in jewelry. He nodded at her left hand, where her wedding ring stood out next to her engagement ring. The diamond on the last one was at least 5 carats. She was stunned. It was a nice compliment from a stranger who said it as if he wasn't even trying to make a compliment, but was simply stating a fact. Most people were too afraid of her husband to say more than that she looked very nice. Stunningly attractive. She liked it, but he still laughed at her. Thank you for the compliment, sir, she said with a displeased expression. The man nodded and, to her amazement, returned to his tablet. That was enough for her. If she wanted to be ignored, she would have stayed home. She stood up and grabbed her purse and coffee. Thanks again for the coffee. Good luck, she said coldly. And all the best to you, the man replied, without taking his eyes off the tablet. She left the cafe completely furious. Her heels clicked loudly on the tiles as she walked away. Randall looked at her out of the corner of his eye and laughed quietly. Nothing will come of this. You understand, right? Said a female voice in his left ear. He grinned again. Oh, you of little faith. 2 days later, Andrea walked into the cafe again, and her eyes immediately found him. His indifference towards her, mixed with a beautiful compliment, haunted her all day. The next day, she forced herself not to go get coffee to try to get it out of her mind. However, when she saw him this time, she felt something change inside. She ordered her mochaccino, and when she turned to the door, he looked at her and smiled. She promised herself that if she saw him again, she would pass by without paying attention to him. But that smile changed everything. She took her bag and slowly walked towards his table, on which lay a leather bag and a thick textbook. It's good to see you again, he said, rising to his feet. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Will you keep me company? Her pride told her to pass by, but she surprised herself when she smiled back and sat down opposite him. He looked at her and openly admired her silk blouse and flowing skirt, which ended well above her knees. Her white high heels accentuated her figure. You look amazing, he said softly. Despite herself, Andrea felt her cheeks flush slightly. His reaction to her was completely opposite to what it had been when they first met, and this immediately endeared her to him. Thank you, she replied, her gaze sliding over him again. He was wearing dark blue trousers and a long-sleeved shirt. The shirt was unbuttoned at the collar and the cuffs were turned up twice, exposing his muscular forearms. A light brown sports jacket lay on the back of another chair. She put her bag on the table and took a sip of coffee, not knowing what to say. Her gaze fell on the book in front of him. What are you reading? She asked, looking at him over her cup. Randall tore his eyes away from the beautiful brunette and looked at his book. This is an entomology textbook. I teach at a university. Her curiosity increased, and she raised her eyebrows. Insects, huh? He smiled and took off his glasses, finally allowing her to see his crystal blue eyes. Not too disgusting. Andrea laughed. No, not at all. As a child, I loved insects. I constantly brought praying mantises into the house to scare my mother. Randall laughed. Yes, I like them too, but my real passion is lepidopterology. Andrea exclaimed enthusiastically. Butterflies, she smiled widely. I love butterflies. I have an entire garden dedicated to them. This is my favorite place in the world. Randall smiled back. This is wonderful. I would love to see him. Andrea covered her mouth and laughed quietly. I don't think this is a good idea for my husband. Hi, honey. I brought a stranger to show him my garden. It was only when she saw his eyebrows rise that she realized what she had said and blushed even more. He lowered his eyes and said quietly, "Thanks for the compliment." He looked into her eyes again. At that moment, their gazes met and lingered longer than they should have. "Which butterfly is your favorite?" Randall asked, breaking the awkward pause. "I'm Queen Alexandra's birdwing," she answered quietly. Randall sat back, impressed. "Very beautiful creature, and also poisonous. I wonder what that says about you." Andrea blushed again. "I have a tattoo of her," she added quietly, smiling at her thigh, "in a place that I cannot show you." His smirk made her feel a little awe. "It's a pity. I'd love to see it." The thought of him instantly flashed into her mind. The image of his head between her legs, the way he was covering her tattoo with kisses, made her shudder, as if she had been doused with ice water. She looked at her watch. "Is it already time? Sorry, I have to go." The man stood up and smiled. "It was very nice talking to you, Andrea. I hope we can chat again sometime." She stood up nervously and gathered her things. "Well, you always need coffee, so I guess we'll see each other again." "I'd be glad," Randall said with a smile. Their gazes met once again. His blue eyes followed her graceful figure as she left the cafe and lingered in her thoughts for a long time. Dante leaned back in his chair and groaned quietly. He thought there was at least one advantage to his wife's coffee habit. He looked down at Regina as she slowly pleasured him. She was not only an excellent cook, but also adept at such skills. He loved her curvaceous figure, especially when she knelt next to his huge desk. He desperately wanted to take her, but alas, this woman was married. Occasional pleasure was the most she was willing to do to break her marital vows. One day he tried to move forward, but she made it clear that she would quit if he insisted on it. He was smart enough to realize that losing a chef who knew good pasta would be a big mistake, and he backed down. Dante buried his fingers in her black hair and moaned her name. "Regina, this is amazing." Gasping, Dante collapsed exhaustedly into a chair. Regina stood up, tidied up her uniform and apron, and was about to leave, but Dante stopped her. "Wait," he croaked. He reached into the desk drawer, took out several bills, folded them in half, and put them in her apron pocket. "Thank you, Regina. You are always on top," he said with a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Coveney," she replied, wiping the corners of her mouth with her fingertips. Smiling sexy, she licked her fingers and left the office. Anthony saw Regina leave Mr. Coveney's office. He had long been unrequitedly in love with Regina and was jealous of the attention she paid to her boss. Every attempt he made to get close to her ended in a quick rejection, and then he noticed how she took out rolled-up bills from her apron pocket. She smiled as she counted the money. Before Anthony could comprehend what he had seen, the door opened again. To his shame, Anthony breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that it was only Andrea. "Hi, Anthony. Did you miss me?" she asked joyfully. He didn't have time to answer and just watched her gorgeous hips sway as she walked up the stairs. She looked down and smiled at the young guard as she approached the top landing. She paused for a moment, reflecting on her life. If her husband had not been afraid to leave the confines of his home and estate, she might have had the opportunity to sleep with this huge, handsome man, as she had always dreamed of. Although he was not very smart, his toned body and boyish smile always made her think of sinful thoughts. She entered her room and locked the door. If someone had been nearby a few minutes later, they would have heard the sound of the electronic device and her grateful moans. Andrea walked into the cafe the next day with a smile. Randall was sitting at another table, his head buried in a textbook and writing something on a piece of paper. She couldn't resist and, passing by, gently ran her fingers over his broad shoulders. His smile made her feel great. "It's good to see you again, Randall." She stopped and looked at him. "Randall sounds so formal. Don't you ever just be called Randy?" Her seductive look and smile clearly made her hint clear. The tall man stood up. Again, Andrea noticed his resemblance to Clark Kent. There were definitely muscles hidden under that iron shirt. She had no doubt about that. She had a great desire to rip his glasses off. Their eyes met. They call me that more and more often lately. His gaze was as electric as hers. I haven't grabbed my coffee yet. Can I give you a treat? He suggested. Andrea smiled. Vanilla latte with whipped cream, please. When they sat down at the table, he smiled. I brought something for you. She was intrigued by his tone. Randall picked up his leather bag from the chair and pulled out a large hardcover. He handed her the book. The cover featured a butterfly wing. Andrea read the headline, Fine Lines, Vladimir Nabokov's Scientific Art. Nabokov. Is this the same one who wrote an indecent story about an old man and a young girl? Randall leaned closer and replied, The same one. But most people don't know that he was also an outstanding lepidopterist. He made thousands of beautiful drawings of butterflies and moths. Many of them are presented in this book. She leaned over and opened the book. At the same time, Randall also moved closer, and their faces were only a few centimeters from each other. Beauty, he whispered barely audibly, as if he had not intended to say it out loud. Andrea smiled softly and looked down at the book. Inside were many beautiful color illustrations of the world's most stunning butterflies. They spent more than half an hour together, enthusiastically looking at these works of art. She gasped when she found a picture of her favorite butterfly, the Queen Alexandra birdwing. Here it is, my tattoo, she exclaimed joyfully, smiling. The illustration perfectly captured the vibrant green and blue hues of the species' wings. The drawing took up almost 2 pages, since the wingspan of this butterfly can reach 25 centimeters. Where did you get this book? Asked Andrea. This is from my collection. I have a lot of books on entomology and lepidopterology, and I also have a large collection of dried butterflies. He looked into her eyes. I could show you sometime, if you're interested. Andrea realized she had been holding her breath. She took a deep breath and closed the book. It's time for me to go. Disappointment was written all over Randall's face. Well, then I wish you a good day. See you next time, he said softly, with tenderness in his eyes. Andrea's smile seemed forced. Well, a girl always needs her coffee. See you later, Randy. As he watched her leave the cafe, the woman's voice rang in his ear again. I can't believe it. Andrea made herself comfortable on the large leather sofa, resting her head on her husband's lap. He smiled and gently stroked her hair. The room was dark, and the large TV was playing one of her favorite nature channels. At first, Dante was terribly bored with constant programs about animals, but over time he appreciated them, and now enjoyed watching them with her in the evenings. It was interesting and served as a pleasant distraction from the stresses of his world. When will you finally take me to Washington as you promised? I want to see the Natural History Museum, she asked softly. Dante sighed. You know that's impossible. Andrea stood up abruptly and stared at him. No, this is impossible for you, because of this stupid contract on your head. You promised to sort this out a year ago. She watched as his jaw clenched in irritation. Darling, I'm going crazy with boredom. If I spend another year in captivity, I will go crazy. Her voice sounded pleading, but still confident. She moved closer and smiled. Listen. She patted him on the shoulder, still smiling. What do you think of the idea? We'll disguise you. Let's put on jeans and a t-shirt. Shave your mustache and beard. Maybe we can get a haircut. No one will recognize you without your $8,000 suits. We can sneak in the cook's car. We'll just leave together. Secretly. Dante stood up abruptly and walked away. Honey, what self-respecting gangster doesn't have a contract on his head these days? She joked after. He gave her a look of indignation and never returned to their room that night. The next morning, Randall wasn't surprised to see Andrea at the cafe, but she still managed to surprise him. She was wearing a tight black bodycon-style dress. The knitted dress with a stand-up collar fit her like a second skin. She wore black leather shoes with 4-inch heels that showed off her legs and butt incredibly. Andrea did not go to the counter for coffee, but went straight to it. I'd like to see your collection if you have time, she said with a hint in her voice. Did you say that your house is very close? Randall looked surprised by this turn of events. Yes, but are you sure you don't want to take coffee? He asked with a slight smile. Their gazes met. I'm sure, she answered, nodding briefly. He smiled. Okay, then let's go. It's just a few minutes' walk. But Andrea, without looking back, said, I'll take you by car. Andrea pounced on him as soon as the door to his apartment closed. He led her inside and began to talk about his books, when suddenly she sharply pressed him against the wall next to the door, clenching his blue shirt in her fists. Take off your glasses, she ordered with a hoarseness in her voice. Her whole body was trembling with impatience. He grinned, took off his glasses, and threw them on the table along with his keys. Their eyes met, and he grabbed her around the waist, pulling her towards him. She put her arms around his neck and kissed him passionately. You're so beautiful, he whispered, breathless between kisses. He greedily bit into her neck, biting and kissing her skin. Andrea ran her fingers through his thick hair and looked around. The living room of the apartment was clean and comfortably furnished. Opposite, it was an open kitchen. The sofa was turned into a bed with clean sheets. One thought flashed through her mind, and she pushed him away. What else is this? She pointed to the unfolded bed. Were you waiting for me or someone else? Randall looked confused, but quickly understood what she meant. No woman wants to feel predictable. No, not at all, he answered with a smile. He pointed to the closed door across the room. I broke up with my girlfriend 3 weeks ago, and almost all the furniture was hers. It's all piled up in the bedroom, and she'll come pick it up when she moves to Los Angeles next month. He nodded shyly towards the unfolded bed. So I'm sleeping on this sofa for now until I buy new furniture. Andrea relaxed, realizing that his explanation was quite logical. She stepped towards him and apologized. Sorry, I think I ruined the moment, huh? Randall wasn't going to waste this opportunity. He took a step towards her and smiled predatorily. Taking a deep breath, he placed his hand on her neck, slowly moving up to her chin. Their eyes met again, and he kissed her passionately. His hand gripped her chin tighter, and her breath hitched. No, I don't think so, he whispered. His kiss was passionate and his hug tight. Andrea literally disappeared into his arms. Oh, Randy, she whispered when their lips finally parted. Her heart was pounding as his hands slid down to cup her buttocks. She bit her lower lip, feeling his fingers lift her dress, lingering on the thin strip of her panties. With a wild look, Randall spun her around and pinned her against the wall. Her hands instinctively rested against the wall, and her body shuddered with excitement. Why, yes, Randy, she moaned. She felt him tug her panties down and kick them off her legs. Anthony had already unbuttoned his trousers, and they fell to the floor. Andrea felt his touch give her a familiar shiver. Her body responded instinctively, tensing slightly as if expecting something inevitable. She understood that between them there was that same spark that was missing in the last months of her life. Andrea knew it was wrong, but it was beyond her strength to resist. His hands slowly slid down her back, and she felt her heart begin to beat faster. She couldn't ignore the wave of emotions that washed over her. It seemed that her whole being was striving for this moment to never end. But even in this fit of passion, her consciousness was reminded of her life, that this act could destroy everything. Please don't leave any traces. My husband, she whispered quietly, trying to keep herself from falling into the pool of feelings. They both froze for a moment, realizing that there was much more behind this than simple physical attraction. It was something more, something that made her think about her life, about her future. It was the moment that seemed to change everything. Andrea sighed, turning over and gently pushing him away, as if trying to give herself more time to think. She wanted to control this moment, to prolong it so that she could make the right decision. She knew that this could be decisive in her life. He looked at her with surprise and perhaps even admiration. She smiled in turn, playing with the boundaries of the moment. Her heart was beating as fast as the first day they met, and she could not cope with the thoughts that haunted her. This person was something new and unusual for her, and her mind was torn between following her desires or trying to maintain the previous order in her life. Andrea took a deep breath, trying to stop her hands from trembling. She slowly took off her dress, throwing it on the floor, as if thereby throwing off the burden of doubts and contradictions. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unclasped her bra, letting it fall to the floor next to her dress. Now, standing in front of him, she felt naked not only physically, but also emotionally, as if she had opened up to him more than ever before. Randall looked at her, not hiding his admiration. His gaze was riveted on her body, but there was something more than just attraction in his eyes. It was a mixture of respect and surprise, as if he had just seen something incredibly important and valuable to him. He slowly took off his shirt, and Andrea couldn't help but hold her breath. His body, strong and toned, seemed the embodiment of masculine strength and confidence, but at the same time there was something soft about him, almost vulnerable. They stood opposite each other, absorbed in the moment, without saying a word. There was something exciting in this silence, as if they were both trying to understand what this moment meant for each of them. "Why am I here? Why did I choose him?" flashed through Andrea's head, but the answers to these questions seemed elusive. She knew that this step could change everything, but she also understood that perhaps this was exactly what she was looking for, changes that would open up new horizons for her. Moving closer, she raised her hand and lightly touched his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin under her fingers. Her gaze slid over his body, and she felt her doubts begin to melt away. This moment was not just passion or desire. It was about finding something in another person that would help her understand herself. Randall gently picked her up, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling completely safe in his arms. Instead of a sharp impulse, there was a certain tenderness in their movements, as if each of them was trying not to upset this delicate balance between the physical and emotional. When they were on the bed, Andrea, without taking her eyes off his face, felt the growing tension finally give way to calm. This was not just a random moment of passion, but an opportunity to get closer to something true, something she had long since lost in her daily life. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to be completely absorbed in the moment. Andrea's breathing was unsteady, and turning on her side, she pulled him towards her, their bodies still hot after intense passion. He kissed her neck tenderly, hugging her from behind. She looked at her watch and smiled and said, "I have to go, honey. I just went out for coffee." Randall, still leaning back on his elbow, grinned. "Well, maybe next time you can go shopping." Dante was just leaving his office with the accountant when Andrea returned home. She was in a great mood, her face glowed with happiness, and she almost fluttered as she walked through the door. She stood up on her tiptoes and kissed Anthony on the cheek. "Wow, thank you, Mrs. Coveney," Anthony muttered, clearly surprised by her attention. Andrea walked past him in her high heels and tight dress, and Dante frowned as he watched her. He knew that gait of hers and that shining look. It was the expression she had after good sex. He himself had seen her in this state more than once. She approached him, smiling sweetly. Her steps were as smooth and graceful as on the catwalk. She noticed his displeased look and came up to kiss him. "Did you have a bad day, dear?" she asked tenderly. Dante quickly pulled himself together, waving his hand, pointing at his accountant, who went into the kitchen. "Yes, the market, you understand. Since he went into legal business, his business has become subject to the whims of Wall Street, like everyone else. Sometimes he wished he could go back to the old days, when crimes brought real money. But now the risks of ending up in prison for life, like Capone, were too great. Staying in prison for the rest of your life is not a good retirement plan. Well, I'll go take a shower. It's hot as hell outside," she said. "Will you join me?" Her voice was seductive. Dante forced a smile. "Not now, dear. I need to make some calls." Andrea waved her hand. "You keep saying that, and in the end, I will actually end up in the arms of another man." She turned sharply and left. Dante frowned, knowing full well that this had most likely already happened. Again. Dante watched grimly as Andrea walked away. He knew her too well not to realize that behind this joke there could be a hint of truth. This wasn't the first time she cheated, but this time it felt different. Too obvious flirting, too frequent absences for coffee, and his intuition, which he never ignored, suggested that things had gone too far. After she disappeared to the second floor, Dante headed to the east wing of the house. The CCTV room looked like something that could be found in a military base. Huge monitors covered the walls, each showing sections of the house and surrounding area, including the roofs of the buildings and the main entrance. There was not a single corner that was not under surveillance. Two people sat without taking their eyes off the screens, closely watching what was happening. When a contract was announced on his head a year ago, Dante seriously strengthened security measures. Not everyone was happy that he left the criminal world, and many of his former allies, as well as enemies, wanted to eliminate him. Life on my own property now felt like imprisonment. Every time he left the house, he was accompanied by armed guards and his car was bulletproof. After passing the guards, Dante headed into the next room. There was a whole arsenal: weapons, walkie-talkies, equipment, and other devices. A young man with dark hair and dark skin sat at the table, absorbed in his work. "Hi, Frank," Dante said, approaching the table. Frank raised his head and smiled. "Hello, Mr. Coveney. How are you?" Dante cleared his throat, looked around the room, and lowered his voice. "I need one of those GPS tracker devices." Frank nodded, opened a small drawer in his locker, and took out a tiny device that looked like a flash drive. He examined it carefully under the light. "Do you want me to track it myself, or?" Dante shook his head and handed him his phone. "No, I can handle it myself." Frank quickly set up the device, syncing it with Dante's phone, and returned the smartphone to him. "Here, everything is ready. The tracker will connect to any Wi-Fi network and can track your location for 96 hours. Use a tracking app. It will also show the approximate address where the item is located." Dante thanked him with a curt nod, then took the device and headed back into the house. His thoughts were already far away. Now he knew what to do. If Andrea is really cheating, he will know for sure and quickly. 2 days later, Anthony was nearly falling asleep at his post at the front door when he heard. "Anthony," he turned around sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol. Relief came only when he saw Mr. Coveney in front of him with a tense expression on his face. "Oh my God, Mr. Coveney, you almost scared me," he muttered. Dante ignored his fear and handed Anthony a folded piece of paper. "Here's the address. Go there. Call me when you arrive." Anthony looked at the piece of paper with the written address and looked up at Dante in surprise. "Okay, boss, I'll go." Half an hour later, Dante received a call. "Hey, Mr. Coveney, I'm there." "What kind of place is this?" Dante asked. "This is, an apartment on the first floor, not very luxurious." "Oh, wait, look, her Jaguar is parked here." Here Anthony's voice became more tense. "Oh no." "Come to the door, Anthony, and listen to what's there," Dante ordered, his voice sounding deeper and more dangerous. "Oh, Mr. Coveney, really? I don't want to interfere with." Anthony hesitated. "Do what I say, or you don't have to come back," Dante interrupted him in an icy tone. Several seconds of silence passed before Dante heard heavy footsteps on the phone. They fell silent, and then Anthony's voice was heard again, full of regret. "Okay, Mr. Coveney, I heard everything." "What did you hear?" Dante asked, gritting his teeth. "Well, Mrs. Coveney, she, screamed." "Did you scream? How?" Dante clenched the handle of his desk until his knuckles turned white. "Well, how she screams when, you're upstairs with her sometimes," Anthony answered with obvious displeasure. There was no answer. Dante hung up the phone, stood up from the table, and headed towards his bar. After pouring himself a few sips of bourbon, he stood in silence, contemplating his next steps. A few minutes later, he returned to Frank's room. "How can I help you today, Mr. Coveney?" The technician greeted him with a smile. Exactly 13 blocks away, Randall's head fell back as Andrea pleasured him. He ran his fingers through her beautiful dark hair. Randall and Andrea spent time together, immersed in passion and mutual pleasure. He felt how she responded to his every move. Their intimacy was filled with energy and sincere emotions. Randall admired her grace and beauty, watching as her body responded to his touch. He gently supported her as they continued to delve deeper into their emotional connection. Their laughter and mutual smiles filled the room. They enjoyed the moment of unity, forgetting everything around them, and eventually fell into silence, remaining in a state of peace and intimacy. "Oh God, this is so much better than coffee," she whispered in his ear as his thick body collapsed on top of her. Anthony had not been feeling well for several days. All he could do was act naturally around Mr. and Mrs. Coveney, who seemed able to carry on with life as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He knew this wasn't the first time the Mrs. had found herself a side figure. About a year ago, she met a personal trainer who helped her lose weight. He knew that Mr. Coveney was no angel himself, and he allowed the matter to continue until it became a source of embarrassment to him. One day, she came home early in the morning and looked like she had had a hell of a night. Mr. Coveney then sent a couple of men to convince the young man that leaving the city was in the best interests of his future movement. "Goodbye, Anthony. See you around lunch," Andrea purred as she walked past him and grabbed a mint from a dish on the console table next to her purse. She stuck her phone in there and took it. "Are you going to have coffee?" Anthony said, much calmer than he felt. She flashed a dazzling smile, which made him a little excited. "No, I'm going to get a facial and new makeup." She turned to the side, offering him her profile. "It takes effort and product to look this good at my age." Her open and personal behavior made him forget himself and say what he was thinking. "I don't think that's true. I bet you look gorgeous, fresh out of your shower." Andrea stopped and looked at Anthony, who suddenly realized how inappropriate his comment was. She walked towards him, maintaining eye contact. He wanted to apologize, but couldn't find the words. She stopped in front of him and smiled seductively. "Wouldn't you like to know that, huh? I saw the way you look at me," she whispered. Sorry, Anthony stuttered. She covered his lips with her finger, silencing him. She pursed her lips. "And I just love it." 20 minutes later, Dante came up again and again and scared the crap out of poor Anthony. "Anthony," Mr. Coveney shouted, without taking his eyes off the phone. Then he looked up at the man's wide, frightened eyes. "Why, yes, boss," he almost shouted back. Dante glanced at the tall man in the blue jacket. "Do you have a gun with you?" Anthony looked at his boss in surprise, confused by this seemingly ridiculous question. "Well, of course, boss." Dante glanced out the window at the spot where his wife's Jaguar usually parked. "Go, bring the car." Anthony sat nervously behind the wheel of his boss's Lincoln. "Mr. Coveney, are you sure this is a good idea?" He noticed Mrs. Coveney's Jaguar parked across the street. Mr. Coveney sat next to him, wearing Bluetooth headphones, staring intently at his phone. As his face turned red, it was obvious that he was getting angrier. Finally, the older man growled and ripped off his headphones, smashing them against the dashboard several times. The damage to the headphones cut off the audio signal, and suddenly Anthony could hear the sound. "Who is the boss here?" the invisible man said loudly. There was a sound that could only be the sound of flesh hitting flesh. "Ah, you. Oh God, you." Anthony heard Mrs. Coveney's voice, full of passion. "That's it." The male voice sounded again. "Your husband never had sex with you like that, right?" Another bang followed. "Never. Only you," Mrs. Coveney replied. With a furious roar, Dante Coveney, head of the Coveney crime family, jumped out of the car, forcing Anthony to hastily unbuckle his seatbelt and get out without being hit by a passing car. Dante had already crossed the street when Anthony caught up with him, wishing they had brought a couple of guys with them to prevent Mr. Coveney from killing anyone. As they approached the red door, Dante gave Anthony an angry look and nodded towards the door. Anthony mentally prayed, hoping the door wasn't reinforced like so many doors were these days. The days of confidently knocking down doors are almost over. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a pistol, and took the safety off. Then he took a couple of steps back and ducked down. Andrea screamed and screamed as the door to the apartment slammed open. She saw her husband push past Anthony and rush towards them. Dante's first look at the room was like pouring kerosene on a fire. A young, fit, dark-haired man was having sex with Andrea, clutching her dark hair in his right hand. Enraged, he rushed towards the sofa bed, noting his wife's wide eyes. Andrea quickly came to her senses, sat down on the sheet, and pulled another one over herself, covering her sweaty, naked body. She gasped when she saw the large gun in Anthony's right hand. It was clear from his expression that Anthony would rather be anywhere but here. Dante stopped at the edge of the bed, his face twisted into an angry grimace. "I've had enough of your betrayals," he almost shouted, and Anthony stood next to him. Anthony held a gun at a surprisingly calm, naked man sitting at the edge of the folding sofa. Recovering from her fright, Andrea shouted back, "Yes, you are the same. At least I don't bring them home. I found used condoms from your pleasures with this interior designer." She made a gesture of quotation marks in the air with her hands. The sheet slid down, revealing her magnificent breasts that Anthony had always wanted to see. This didn't stop Dante, and he turned to Randall. "And you're some kind of college teacher, right? You didn't have enough students, and you decided to take someone else's wife and make a cuckold out of him." He looked at his wife again and shook the phone at her. "I tapped your purse. I heard everything," he shouted. Anthony watched as the blood drained from Andrea's face. She pulled the sheet back up and tried to look remorseful. "Oh, honey, you know how I can talk when you're juicing me the right way. I'll say whatever you want." Dante stared at Randall, contemplating his next steps. "Anthony," he began. "Yes, boss." Anthony raised the gun to eye level, looking through the sights at the naked man. He waited nervously for the next order. It would be several hours before he knew whether the order would come at all. Dante turned to his man, hearing Anthony make a strange sound, like he was gargling something in his throat. His eyes widened as he saw Anthony's body shake violently. The large pistol clattered to the floor moments before Anthony himself collapsed onto the tiles with a loud thud. "What the hell?" Dante shouted, noticing two arrows protruding from Anthony's back. He followed the wires to the hand of a naked Asian woman who was holding a stun gun. She pulled the trigger again, causing Anthony's body to twitch again. She looked at Dante and smiled widely. "Who the hell are you?" he asked with obvious fear in his voice. Anthony's trembling made him realize how vulnerable he was now. The voice from the bed came again. In this case, "you" should be understood as plural. Dante turned sharply towards the bed and saw the same naked man sitting in place, but now a pistol with a small caliber silencer appeared in his hands, as if out of thin air. Andrea's eyes widened as she stared at the man who had given her pleasure only a few minutes ago. Randall looked at the Asian woman who came closer and stuck the syringe needle into Anthony's ass, right through his pants. Honey, why are you naked?" he asked with a grin. She straightened up and smiled back at him. "Well, the professor and I are tired of hearing you two have sex, so." "Well," she finished with a slight shrug. She flicked the used syringe as the needle pierced the drywall behind the couch, putting an exclamation point on the moment. Andrea asked with a puzzled expression on her face. "Professor." She looked around, looking from Randall to the woman. The petite woman pointed to the previously closed bedroom. "Yes, Randall Peterson, professor of entomology, is tied up in the bedroom. Very nice guy." She came up behind Dante, and with a strong blow to his legs made him fall to his knees. Dante groaned as his 50-something knees slammed into the tile floor. She searched for him before stepping back. Andrea's jaw dropped when it finally dawned on her. "You are hired killers." The thin woman answered with a predatory smile. "I prefer the term assassins. It's gender neutral and sounds much more menacing." "What are we talking about?" Dante growled. Randall smiled. "We are talking about $2 million put on your head." The elderly man shuddered. "You arranged all this. They kidnapped a professor, moved into his apartment, seduced, and had sex with my wife." Randall smiled widely. "Only to lure you out without your protection. I assumed that a blow to your ego would work. Our employer let us know that you have the technology to track her and possibly eavesdrop on her. Dante sighed heavily. And who is your employer? Over the past year, he hasn't been able to find out who put the reward on him. Randall raised his gun, pointing it at Dante. Carmine sends his regards to you. No. Everyone was stunned when Andrea jumped out of bed and threw herself in front of her husband, shielding him with her body. The sheet fell to the floor, forgotten. Carmine, Andrea exclaimed. But he's our friend. Randall looked at his naked companion and nodded towards the nightstand. The Asian woman placed the stun gun on Anthony's butt, walked over to the nightstand, and took Randall's phone. She opened the screen and scrolled through a few photos. Then she turned the phone to the couple. Security camera photos showed Dante and another woman on the veranda engaged in lewd acts. Andrea turned to her husband. You had sex with Carmine's wife at his house during his party on the lawn. Dante looked away from his wife in embarrassment. Yes, exactly, Randall confirmed. If you have any last words for your husband, speak now, beauty. She turned back to Randall. Wait, please wait. This is crazy. It's all about sex, right? Call him. Call Carmine. Randall looked at her in bewilderment and took aim again. It doesn't work like that. Call Carmine and tell him that if he cancels the order, I will come to his house and have sex with him so much that he won't be able to walk for a week. Now it was Randall's turn to be surprised. He glanced at his partner, who just shrugged. Leaving a city without leaving behind bodies sometimes had its advantages. No, honey, don't, Dante wheezed. Andrea turned with a furious look. Shut up, Dante. His eyes widened and his mouth opened as if he wanted to object, but no words came. Randall smiled at Andrea. You were a great lover, he said. Andrea hesitated in embarrassment and blushed. He nodded to his partner. Okay, make a call. She nodded and went into the hallway to dial the number. 2 minutes later, she returned with a surprised expression on her face. Everything is settled, and we will still receive the full amount. Dante and Andrea collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing and holding each other tightly. Randall chuckled as he picked up Anthony's gun and began gathering his clothes. Randall chuckled, picked up Anthony's gun, then began to gather his clothes. Have we packed our things? He asked, glancing into the bedroom where the real Professor Randall Peterson lay tied up on the bed. A red gag was sticking out of his mouth. The shirt was unbuttoned and the pants were pulled down to the knees. There was an expression of relief on his face. Sorry for the inconvenience, Doc. It's been a pleasure spending the last week or so with you, Randall said, bidding farewell to the professor, who waved his arms helplessly and relaxed on the mattress, groaning pitifully. The two assassins were getting dressed as they watched their former target and his wife sitting on the floor in an embrace. The Asian beauty threw their bags over her shoulder. Hey, could you untie the professor before you go? The big guy will wake up in an hour with a terrible headache, Randall added, nodding at Anthony. The mercenaries turned around and left without waiting for an answer. Outside, they threw their bags into the trunk of their regular gray SUV and got into the car. The woman turned to her partner as she got behind the wheel. She'll have to give Carmine that kind of sex for $2 million. Was she that good? She asked with a malicious smile. His face contorted as if from an absurd thought, and he gave the correct answer. Compared to you, dear, no way. A maximum of $1.5 million will last.